Sorry. Why, hello there. My name is Christopher Balkrin, and I found myself watching the Jubilee YouTube video of Ben Shapiro versus 25 Kamala Harris supporters. And what I found was Ben Shapiro's answers at times were quite, at times were quite inflammatory, or at least not as moderate, perhaps, as others may like. So I thought to myself, why don't I take the role of Ben Shapiro and see if I could answer some of these questions that would get at least people thinking more critically about Kamala Harris and some of the policies that she's put forward. So what I'm going to do is a bit of role play. I'm going to be Ben Shapiro in this case, and I'm going to share my screen to share with you the questions that these Kamala Harris supporters asked Ben Shapiro. And hopefully by the end, you will get a more moderate kind of understanding of the criticisms towards Kamala Harris and some of the policies that are less, right versus left, but instead based on a more moderate tone. So let's go for it. Let's start, and let's see how this goes.
My first claim is Kamala Harris's attempt to put DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion at the center of her policies is destructive.
Kind of cool. They all run for it.
How's it going, dude? Where do I get one of those hats?
Oh, my boy made it for me.
Nice.
So yeah, first of all, we're standing on stolen indigenous Tongva land, right? This is.
Are you moving anytime soon?
Land? No, but
Why?
The fact of the matter is I'm born and raised California. We're talking about diversity, equity, and vision. We should.
So why don't
we absolutely
you
should.
could do it today, right now.
We should,
but that's not my point here. The point is you're saying that diversity, equity, inclusion is destructive.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So when we look at this country that is built off the backs of slavery and white supremacy, taking the lead, building the roots and foundations of everything that you know and believe today, it's ironic to see a Black and Indian woman who's rising up to the occasion against society, pushing them down. And this isn't just the fact that they're Black and Indian and a woman, it's the fact that
Can you give me an example of how society pushed Kamala Harris down, please?
The demographic of people is what I'm talking about.
Well, yeah, but you suggested that Kamala Harris is being pushed down by society.
I'm not suggesting that, no.
I mean, that's
so my point.
Okay, so it's unfortunate that this person was voted out, but I would want to answer that person's questions. First, I don't fully agree with this whole stolen land idea. Of course, the land is stolen, but it's conquered, and there's something to be said about why it's so important for liberals and Democrats to talk about stolen land from indigenous peoples. This is a conquered land by a colonial power, and the recognition of the fact that it is conquered and yet nothing is to be done other than I should really start this over, but anyways, we'll keep it going.
Is saying that
I'm sorry, you've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seat.
Good to meet you.
Try that again.
Whoa.
Hey, Ben.
Hey, how's it going?
Nice to meet you. So my opening question to you would be, why is that a destructive thing? Why is that a bad thing when for a long time in this country, I feel personally that white men have had an advantage over some communities that have been discriminated against. So why would you say that that is a destructive thing and not, making up for lost time?
Sure. So let me explain what I mean.
What I would say as to why DEI is a destructive force is because there's a couple points. One is people are being considered for more senior and executive levels, not on the basis, this is the risk of DEI, not on the basis of their performance, but on the basis of checking a box. And that is a real threat. So for example, as major public companies are looking, quote, to diversify their boards or senior and executive management, the real risk with that is people may be promoted ahead of where their capabilities may be at. And that will lead to a lot of resentment by others. Now, there's not enough data to support that claim because I don't think we are actually studying that data in as much detail as we should, we being the research community. That is one of many of the criticisms I have of DEI. In diversifying boards, it runs the risk of, again, promoting people perhaps ahead of where their capabilities are. And also associated with that, the second point I would say to that is people are going to look at you in a very one-dimensional way. Christopher Balkrin, he's brown-skinned. We need a brown-skinned person on our board. Regardless of Christopher's capabilities or what he has to say, they're only looking at me for my race. If you're part of the LGBTQ community, they're only looking at you on the basis of your sexual orientation and gender identity. And this is where I think a lot of moderates actually have concerns. I think on paper, it makes a lot of sense, but in practice, there's real issues with that. And we're seeing that in the workplace. A lot of resentment is being festered by people who don't, quote unquote, check the box. Heterosexual males, heterosexual white females, that feel like they're not being considered for positions because of who they are and what they're promoting. So that is one of the real criticisms of DEI.
Yeah, maybe not everybody, but there certainly has been a large sect of people that has had it harder because of the color of their skin or their sexuality or their gender identity. Could you acknowledge that maybe there's, a middle ground there where it's not all, but there is some people who certainly have had a disadvantage?
I will say that history.
So yes, there definitely are people who have had disadvantages on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, etc. The question then becomes, what is the policy application that we do in response to that? The idea, I think, posed by those on the left, those Democrats and liberals, is that somehow through government intervention, government can be the equalizing force, the equalizing force to undo those injustices through making level playing fields, however we determine that to be. Now, the challenge with doing so is we're now putting so much faith in government to be this arbiter of truth and justice. And I would argue that many attempts to equal the playing field, if you will, lead not necessarily to the best outcomes. And we have to be very, very clear about that. So, for example, when governments put in policies of, okay, well, these disadvantaged groups need to be represented in all aspects of a corporation or an entity, that can lead to a lot of resentment by people of different cultures and communities. But beyond that, the idea that government policy and government programs can be an equalizing force to undo historic injustice is absurd. What is the policy application to an underrepresented group? And then I would also argue, who determines what underrepresented group gets represented, right? So if it's just race, then what about ethnicity? If it's just race and ethnicity, what about gender? What about people with persons with disabilities? People who have visual and hearing impairments that have largely been underrepresented from all aspects of large decision-making bodies. What about people? And I know this sounds whataboutism, but who determines what groups and on what basis? You and I probably can find discrimination based on a whole host of factors that you and I have. So I would argue, who determines what groups and why? And associated with that, when we think of BIPOC, the phrase that many on the left throw around, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, think about that for a second. The order is very important. Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. We know that some of the number 1 and number 2 hate crimes in both the United States and Canada are Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. Both groups are not represented in that acronym. And so I would argue, when we talk about DEI, I would question who's making the determination about what groups are underrepresented. Because I would argue there are many groups that are underrepresented that are not captured in DEI in BIPOC and how people assess DEI. And I think that is a major issue that I think some people on the left don't want to wrestle with for very clear reasons. But we'll continue.
Everybody, thank you.
So you believe that certain economic disparities between racial groups are caused as a result of cultural differences?
Sure.
Yes.
And so what is the backing on this? What would you say contributes to your belief in that?
Okay, so
So I was actually in a position where I was able to tutor students going into the Ivy League, and I specifically was able to tutor Asian students going into the Ivy League, Asian students from Canada applying to the Ivy League. And I would say, based on my experience, that there's no difference between Asian students, white students, black students, Indian students. There's no difference. They go to the same classes, they have the same teachers, etc. The difference becomes a cultural understanding within specific communities of work ethic when it comes to school. And that is, in fact, how academic institutions judge applicants. So, for example, the students that I tutored, on their essays were not anywhere near where I think they could have been. They weren't clear, they weren't to the point, etc. And I was quite harsh with a lot of students about getting things more clear. And I would get emails from those students late into the night, 11, 12 at night, 1, 2 in the morning, saying, like, can you review my latest draft? I spent all night redoing it. And it just showed me over and over and over again that these students were not different than any other, but they would literally spend 6, 7, 8 hours every night doing homework and essay prep. And whether or not, personally, I don't think that's a healthy approach, but I do recognize that work ethic plays a significant role in their success in the Ivy League institutions. And we all know this to be true. I mean, if you look at your workplace, those that generally stay later, come in earlier, spend weekends, those are the individuals who generally are considered for promotions. They go the extra distance, they work extra hard, etc. Now, it's kind of a shame that academic institutions only sometimes look at IQ and all these other like essays and how well you write. Those are markers of practice on a specific product. But if academic institutions instead were to look at, hey, by the way, I come from a single parent home in a low income community, and yes, my average is at 70% or 65%, but I am also playing parent to my younger sibling, or I'm also active in my community. I'm also doing things in my community that round me out, and I would be a benefit, an asset to your school system. I think that actually might change the approach that academic institutions have to accepting students. So let's continue and see what this person says.
not all cultures, for example, value
Groups have been through over time has created this culture where in which they're unable to put themselves ahead. You do say that Asian Americans are more likely to
Studious, shall we say.
study, yes, but we have to take into account that after the Chinese Exclusion Act, Asian Americans were given a certain type of reparations which allowed them into the country. And in
What
order
were
for
the
them,
reparations?
they were given visas, which allowed them to come into the.
Hmm.
Yes, they were given
I-
easier
I understand,
processes
but
into
visas
visas. Yes,
are
which
not
allowed them
reparations.
into. No, it's a form of reparations, which they were once excluded from coming in. And so giving them an easier opportunity to attain these visas allowed them into the US. And
Mhm.
mainly the individuals who were able to attain those were people with higher educations, which is why it may seem that Asian Americans within the country who come in typically with higher incomes as well as higher educational backgrounds, it may come off as that they are more studious than Latino Americans. But what we have to take into account is that Latin America and Hispanic people have faced a lot of
They're-
tremendous setback due to historical
So-
atrocities. It's
The-
not their culture per se.
Hmm.
What you see within
Is there any individual agent?
Okay, so I actually see what this person is trying to say, but I would argue that there, I would argue that there are many exceptions to the rule. We can't always just paint it by a group identity. So one could be that someone is in a very challenging situation with their parents and with their home, and they're still studying and they're still performing at a high level. Those are the rarities. So I would agree with this person that yes, historical injustice does play a factor to some extent. Now, we have to question the extent to which that plays a factor. So, for example, many immigrants who come to Canada and the United States, yes, they generally have money in their bank account. I mean, legal immigrants generally have money in their bank account, generally have a strong work ethic, etc., know what it means to earn a living and keep a living. Historic injustice, like here in Canada, where Indigenous communities have been forced onto the reservation system far away from urban centers, ultimately limit their opportunities, right? Like there's not enough schools, there's not enough educational institutions. Their parents have been traumatized by residential schools. Drug and alcohol addiction is huge. I mean, these are the remnants of historical injustice. I would argue again that those are on the extremes and those do matter. But there is something to be said for individual accountability and achieving something despite the odds stacked against you. And I think that that is often lost by many who, and I would say many identity politics driven ideals. They focus on the extremes, the Indigenous youth in rural Ontario, no school around, can't get through high school, etc. That does happen, and that is real. That is an extreme situation, and I think that youth's better opportunity perhaps is getting a job, leaving the res, getting a job, and then moving up to school if they would choose that. But of course, that matters so much if there's social supports in place, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's a whole host of issues working against that youth. And that does happen. But, there's something to be said for those that are in urban centers from low-income communities who are being told that, if you go to Harvard or Yale, your life will be set. When in actuality, the better pathway for that individual is getting a more sustainable job, working hard and saving up to get out of a low-income community into a more middle-class community where school can then be done on a part-time basis and then potentially even a full-time basis if their finances allow for that, to then upgrade their skills and then figure out what they want to do with their lives. That's all individualism. That has nothing to do with historic injustice. And so I do agree historic injustice does play a role, but the role it plays is on the extremes. It's not on the majority, in my opinion. The majority, if you are in an urban setting, I think we have to rethink what we mean by education, what we're marketing to these youth. It shouldn't be, get into Harvard and your life will be set. Again, the better option for youth in low-income communities is get a higher paying job to get out of the community in which you are in, because we know the impact that community has on your life choices and also the impact it may have on your life itself with higher rates of violence, higher rates of crime, etc. If you get out of those communities and into more lower middle class or middle class communities, your chances of, doing getting better jobs and finding more time to engage in school become more of a luxury. And then as a result of that, you can then upgrade your skills and then move on if that's the case. So I think we're actually marketing things to youth from low-income communities in a very different way, but we'll let this continue.
Agency in here, or is it all historic circumstance?
Everything is based off of history. Everything acclimates. Everything is an accumulation of history.
So to take the single motherhood example, for example,
the way.
that was fun anyway. Whoa!
Ooh, wow, dicey.
Hey, how's it going? How are you? Good to meet you.
So your basis is saying that culturally people don't have the same advantages, right?
No, I don't think I'm saying that. In fact, I don't think I'm saying that at all. What I am saying is that there are certain traits in specific cultures, specific to work ethic, that are valued by academic institutions. Going back to my point, I think that if Harvard and Yale took into account, a student who's from a low-income family and is, playing parent to their younger sibling, is active in their community, and yes, their GPA is lower, but given those other circumstances, most students would not even be applying to university. They'd be doing other things. We might get a more diverse pool of applicants and successful applicants to the Ivy League. But then it becomes the question of whether or not those students will then be successful in an Ivy League situation or environment, because the way they grade students there and the way they look at the way their system is it really does try to make sure that the top academic performing students stay. There are studies about low-income students entering Harvard Law School, and the dropout rates are very high. So anyhow, it's not that their cultures are different. It's that the work ethic instilled in specific cultures are valued by academic institutions.
I'm saying that not every culture sort of initiates the same action within groups.
So in part, you're saying that you're part of each culture. You know what goes on in each culture to say these things.
No,
I could see how someone might think that and infer that, but it's not my position to say that. It's what we see on academic institution applications, and we're trying to piece together why that is. So, when we see a higher level of Asian students applying and being successful in Ivy League applications, naturally we have to infer there's something unique about that culture that separates it from other cultures, and specifically from other first-generation immigrant cultures, other Black, Latino, and white cultures in the United States. And so we don't need to know each culture. We just need to observe the traits that cultures bring that are valued in the application process of Ivy League institutions.
I'm saying that I can analyze the activities of a particular group with reference to their actual behavior.
So if you go into my culture, we're told that we can achieve anything through hard work. We have to work 10 times harder. But you're not part of our culture, so you're explaining something that doesn't have to do with you. But in turn, you're saying that that culture, unfortunately, does not value the same thing that the next culture does.
Well, I'm a bit confused because it's not so 100%. I think that cultures from lower income communities do have to work harder, 100%. It's unfair. And I think, to be honest, like I said earlier, I don't think the appropriate avenue for those from low-income communities is necessarily get into university and or the Ivy League. A better approach, to be honest, is getting a better paying position, a job to get out of those communities, and then start thinking about university, college university, and the Ivy League, should you choose. But yes, that is much harder given your circumstances. So I'm with you. I think that is a disadvantage 100%, but I don't think that it's all due to the low income community altogether. I think there is something to be said about work ethic that we have to acknowledge, and we have to appreciate, which you've just mentioned, working 10 times harder. It's unfair, but also I would argue it's unfair that academic institutions value IQ tests and book smarts and essay writing, which put at a disadvantage so many students who would benefit those institutions that may very well not be book smart, may not very well, write the best or etc. Those can be learned skills, but because of their environment and their circumstances, they're weeded out.
So revealed preference tends to be a better way of doing social science than subjective perception. So revealed preference is how people act in the world. So for example, if you have one group of people who say, we really, really value our kids studying, and then their kids don't study at all, that would be a revealed preference.
Okay.
Everybody has
So
has
then when you
reason to
have
say their kids
people
study.
who say in corporate America, you have people who value nepotism versus actual studying hard. What is that called then?
Okay, so
that's called nepotism. And I'm 100% against nepotism. I think nepotism is bad for our country. It's bad for how we go about, doing the capitalist experience and experiment, because nepotism is real and that does happen. And corruption of corporations are the result of that. And that's no different than the state. Remember, it was the Federalist Papers with the Federalists back in the 1700s who said that, factionalism is in fact a threat to democracy. And so we have to be very clear about what it is that we're against. I'm with you. Factionalism, nepotism, these are things we should be 100% against.
The idea that people generally value nepotism over studying hard, I'd like to see the evidence of that, given the fact the vast majority of wealth in this country is not created through nepotism or through inherited wealth.
But Donald Trump was given nepotism, was he not?
I mean,
100%. I mean, Donald Trump was born to a very successful father. By the way, let's step back from nepotism for a second. All of us have various levels of nepotism or unfair, unequal advantage than others on the basis of nothing else than us being born in a very specific environment. You have advantages over myself, and I have advantages over yourself. Neither of us can explain that. I think that many times liberals and those on the left fall into the trap of fairness and fighting for fairness, when in actuality, life is unfair, and it's unfair quite a bit. And you can't always explain the unfairness of life, but you have to go with the position that you've been given. And yes, it's unfair that there are sons and daughters of billionaires that are automatically wealthier by their birth than 99.9% of the rest of the world. But if we fight for fairness, that's the reality of the world. There are sons and daughters of the princes in Saudi Arabia that are richer than, Elon Musk. But it's the unfairness is the reality. You can't fight for fairness. Life is unfair. And I think this is where a lot of liberals and Democrats fall into that fault line of fighting for that.
He's one example among a bajillion people who are very, very wealthy in this country. I'm very wealthy now. I certainly wasn't born very wealthy.
But then you can't speak on Donald Trump's experience, can you not?
That happens to be the case. Okay, I mean, you can laugh at my particular history, but I grew up in an 1,100 square foot home in Burbank, California.
Afford this.
So that you have to excel 10 times harder than the next person, but then you're not part of the culture. To say that you can actually come to these disparities is kind of far-sighted.
The idea that you have to work 10 times harder coming from South Central based on.
Okay, so yes, it is, again, I agree. It is unfair that that's the case, but that is the reality of it. Like it is unfair for many middle-class Americans and Canadians who can't get into the Ivy League because they have middle-of-the-road grades. They have 75, 78, 80% averages. We're talking about students, the students that I coached to get into the Ivy League, their average across 4 years of high school was 93, 94, 96. I mean, these kids were crushing it. They weren't in any way, shape, or form different than any other. Their work ethic was just wildly different. And so we have to always remind ourselves that the unfairness of life is true. And the way these students correct for the unfairness of life, the fact that they're not great writers, the fact that they're not good at, music class or religion or civics or law class, whatever it is, whatever classes they were struggling with, they doubled down and worked 20 times harder than the next kid to get at that same level where they could maintain that 93% average. That's unfair. That's unfair when you really think about it, right? So you have a kid who's really good at math and science and is crushing it, and they don't even need to study for exams. They're going to crush it. But then there's those other courses where they really do need to study. And they would come to me and on creative writing and essays and English class, and they'd be like, I don't understand. And they would break everything down and they would ask questions that I think were quite good. They were open with their humility in learning, and they would not hesitate to keep on their weaknesses until they got to a higher level of competency of their weakness. That is unheard of. When you really think about it, that is really unheard of. So then they apply to Harvard with a 93 4-year cumulative average, and they have a good essay, and they interview well, and they do stuff in their communities. I mean, that's the unfairness of the situation. And it's unfair that they are working so much harder, but to them, they're like, that's what's required to get into these Ivy League institutions. Now, compare that with your average North American kid, I would consider myself average, who comes home, maybe has a girlfriend, maybe has friends, whatever, spends a night doing that, spends a night doing that, doesn't do his homework all the time, doesn't study as much, doesn't apply himself as much, doesn't reach out to tutors, et cetera, and you get the results that you get. And it's not because I am inferior to these students. It's that there's a culture at work of the types of choices these students make. Now, I don't always think it's the most healthiest to come home every night and work till 12 or 1 in the morning. But it's something a lot of these students internalized and did for 4 years straight. Now, I would, again, argue that's not necessarily healthy, but that's what our academic institutions in the Ivy Leagues value. And we can debate forever whether or not that's a proper value system for them.
And for example, test score is obviously not true. We've had affirmative action programs in this country for solidly 40
now
years.
affirmative action is gone. It's out the door.
Thank
Now
God. It's a bad
DEI
program.
is present. DEI is actually saying that we need to have diversity, equity, inclusion. So you're actually putting a footing in the door for different races, different genders, different women, different men, everything. So now you're saying that because this program is gone, this one isn't.
Sorry, you've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seats.
That was pretty good.
Yeah, like a jackrabbit. Thank you, guys. I appreciate that.
Hi,
how's it going? Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. So, I kind of want to shift the conversation about DEI a little bit away from culture because I don't know if that's necessarily like a helpful conversation to have. And I really want to talk more about representation. So 1 in 5 Americans currently is Hispanic. This country, like it or not, is not a homogenous country. We are a very diverse country. Do you not think that our legislators should be representative of the overall population?
I don't think that legislators necessarily could be representative of the entire population because we would have to ask ourselves a few questions. First of all, the first question is representation on what? Race, ethnicity, gender, religion, able-bodied, deaf, blind, so the question is, what metric are we using for representation? The second question then is, of those people from those groups, why would they apply to becoming a congressperson, a senator, etc.? Right? What would be in it for them specifically if they're from marginalized, to use words that have been already used, marginalized, low income? Why would they apply to be a congressperson or a senator? When we know to apply for those positions, as we all know, it's not a 9 to 5. You're working around the clock. You're getting crapped on by everyone, and it's a high pressure environment. Specifically, if you want to become in cabinet and things like that. So I really do think representation. There's too many things to think about, but also it's not for everyone. Congress and Senate is not a position for every walk of life. You have to remember too that if you're from a low-income community, and let's just say you are, again, a single parent of children, why would you run for Congress or the Senate? Your life is so far removed from Washington and what's happening there. And it's not to say that the voices that you see in your community shouldn't run for Congress and Senate. It's just the issues are so different. You have immediate needs, and to circumvent your immediate needs by running for Congress or Senate, because let's face it, you're not coming home every day at 5 o'clock if you're a person or a senator. You have events in the evenings, you have events on weekends, you have events in the mornings, you have a lot of things taking up most of your days and weeks and months. If you're a single parent from a low-income low-income community, your time with your children, your time in your community is far more important, I would argue, than spending time, debating a bill on Capitol Hill. Now, that's my value judgment, but that could explain why we don't see so many people from these different communities applying to become congressperson or senator. I think it's the reality. And again, the first question, what are we looking for in terms of representation?
I don't see a way that you can have a quote unquote representative legislature with 435 members of Congress in a country of 340 million people, because you can divvy that up however you want. It's not by race. You can do it by sex. You can do it by gender. You can do it by sexual orientation. How exactly do you decide what is quote unquote the representative group? And also, I don't believe that individuals ought to be represented based on group identity. So, for example, I'm Jewish. Jews are actually overrepresented in Congress. I don't think that we ought to decide exactly how many people in Congress are Jewish based on the Jewish population of the country. I think that's actually a pretty silly way to do representation.
Well, we don't have to do it systematically, but fundamentally, there is an issue with the fact that we are not fully represented. Like, the entire population is not represented.
I mean,
we have
that's not
never
true,
had a
though.
black female president. I still have to pay
So-
taxes.
We've never had a
The
Jewish
whole
president.
concept
Who
is
cares?
no taxation without. We have had a white male president. We've had.
Okay, so this is where I think a lot of liberals kind of go off on their like on a kind of like spiral of thought, because the reality is that representation doesn't mean that you represent your community as a whole and the views within that community. There can be an African American president. That person could be Republican. African Americans in the United States have historically, voted Democrat in large numbers. So again, representation based on identity, I think, is the fault line of a lot of DEI experts and a lot of, again, more liberal left-leaning politicians, because by that nature, it means on the basis of Christopher being a first-generation immigrant, brown-skinned, his political viewpoints are already predetermined. And so because of that, we need that representation in Congress and in Senate. When in reality, the positions I hold are not on the basis of my race or ethnicity, but perhaps based on a whole host of other factors. And I think this is where, again, a lot of DEI experts get this fundamentally wrong. Many believe that with greater representation, the issues affecting those communities will be brought forward. And I don't know if there's enough evidence to showcase that to be true. In fact, I would argue prominent African American congresspeople and senators may not have raised all of the issues or many of the issues that African American communities at that time faced. And it's not a necessarily reflection of their association with the community or understanding of the community. It could be that they were more concerned about being a congressperson or a senator because, they felt the certain bills needed to have different ideas and perspectives, etc. Just because you're from a community does not mean you will represent that community in decision-making in decision-making committees, etc., that you're part of. And I think, again, this is the fault line of DEI proponents. But we'll keep letting it play here.
Had like
Well,
45 of them?
whether Jews count as white or not has been sort of an object of debate for
You do.
quite a while. We do. Okay.
You do.
So, it depends according to whom, and that's a pretty recent development. Okay, so
Basically everyone. It's a religion.
Judaism
Do
is
you
on
not
the-
agree that
Ethnicity,
you
is
were
it
a
not?
white man?
I think that it depends on the context in which you're discussing it.
So
Meaning
what
that-
are you, Ben? Are you not a white guy?
I'm a man of
Are you-
Jewish ethnicity, which is sometimes grouped with white and sometimes not. That's the more accurate way to put it. But when
What
we're
else would you
talking
be
about
grouped with?
with Jews,
Jewish
who are
people.
which is an
But it's-
ethnicity,
So
yeah.
you're not white at all.
Again, it depends who's doing the grouping and how. I've seen
So this is, again, another fault line of DEI proponents. Remember, I said at the beginning, BIPOC does not represent Islam, anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. And many times I noticed DEI proponents conflate being white and being Jewish together, when we know anti-Semitism is, in fact, one of, if not the highest hate crimes on a per capita basis in both Canada and the United States. There's, hate crimes towards white people are very rare. They do happen, but they're much more rare. So I find often many DEI proponents conflate both being Jewish and being white.
I've seen Jews grouped with white and Jews grouped with not white. I've seen, are we just pretending that doesn't exist? That's a reality. However, as far as your generalized point, which is that we are supposed to identify people by group identity, if we don't have a black female president, somehow black females have not been represented. So Barack Obama was in no way representative of black females because he's not a female.
No,
He's
he
black.
was. He was representative,
So
but
he was
that's
half
the point.
representative. How do you do the math on this, and why?
You shouldn't do the math on it completely statistically, but the fact
You shouldn't
is
do the math
there's
on it at all. You should treat
clearly
people as individuals.
underrepresented.
You should treat people as individuals.
Well, if you don't even want Kamala Harris to attempt to create DEI initiatives in office, then there isn't even going to be a conversation about it.
Well, I think that there needs to be a conversation, but the what I would argue is that there are far more criticisms of DEI than there are merits, because again, I would argue who is the arbiter of determining what groups get represented and on what basis. That is the question. And again, I think DEI proponents don't want to talk about that. Again, I use the example of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and that to me is a clear symbol of the limitations of DEI thought. It only looks at Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Well, what about this group? What about that group? What about Jewish groups? What about, there are so many groups that are totally not even considered in that acronym. And I think that's exactly the point. I think DEI experts think about, sorry, not DEI experts, the people on this panel think about DEI in a very specific way, which is purposely leaving out groups, because you can't be inclusive of all groups. It's basically impossible if you were to actually break it down. And I think that's the challenge with DEI.
I don't think there ought to be a conversation about why we ought to be represented by race or by sex. I think that we are each individual people with individual ideas. And if that person represents my ideas, I don't care what sex, race, or sexual orientation they are.
I mean, to an extent, yes.
No,
but there
entirely.
is an issue with the lack of empathy in office. We need to be able to empathize and legislate for the people that are living in this country.
I was not
Do you
aware.
not believe?
You know, I actually do see that point. Empathy can be a very strong virtue. But the reality is that you're then assuming that legislators are going to be empathic to very specific concerns of very specific community members. And I would argue, again, we're putting too much faith in our legislators to be the arbiter of truth, the equalizer, the, you know, kind of like the manifestation of a god, a manifestation of a moral hierarchy, that they would do so in very specific circumstances. We have to remember, every choice the government makes is rife with trade-offs, right? So if, for example, the government says, you know, we're going to do these programs for these, low-income Guyanese community members in Toronto, it's like, okay, great. What about other groups that face similar levels of disparity? Well, there are specific, unique attributes that low-income families in the Guyanese community face. Great. What about this group? What about that group? There are trade-offs. And as well, the programs and services you put forward for the Guyanese population in Toronto may not lead to the outcomes in which you want, right? So you may say, hey, by the way, Guyanese community, we know you're low income. We're going to fund your entire university education because we know education generally leads to higher incomes. We know you want to get out of your communities. So we're going to fund your education. You won't have to pay a cent out of your pocket. Now, what happens if Guyanese students, because they're from low-income communities, don't apply to university? What happens then? That intervention has lost all merit. So empathy is very important, but if we use it as a guiding force in policy, what we could find, is that the interventions may not be feasible or work, in many cases work against the principles in which we are fighting for. But again, I'll keep letting this play.
I was not aware that empathy is relegated to particular race solidarity.
No, but I mean, it's easier to be empathetic towards people whose experiences you can fundamentally understand based on your identity. Like, do you not believe that people have an inherent bias?
So first of all, I'm
based
not
on
sure.
identity?
I mean, we can start with the empathy.
100% people have inherent bias based on identity. But the question is, what do we do with that inherent bias? Again, you know, we talk about DEI and we talk about specific groups being held back based on a whole host of other reasons. I would then argue the inherent bias that comes out from that is that we are going to make sure that the overrepresented groups do not continue to be overrepresented, and in some cases be represented at all. There are many instances where people are looking for diversity in their boards and in their staff that don't include the overrepresented groups of the past, and that includes white men as an example. I laugh at this, but you know, it is a real issue that a lot of white men face. So when we talk about representation and inherent bias, a lot of DEI proponents should also be clear about their inherent bias against an overrepresented group, their inherent bias of not wanting to listen to a specific group, in this case, white men, as an example. And this is not untrue of faith-based groups who have felt completely left out of a lot of the social policy that our governments have put forward, specifically on things like abortion, specifically on things like medical assistance in dying, of including religious values in law school and in medical school and in all types of, marriage, right? Like same-sex marriage. A lot of faith-based groups have felt completely excluded in those debates. And so we have to recognize our inherent bias, as uncomfortable as it is when we're talking about these issues, because it is quite uncomfortable. But let's keep it going.
Empathy itself, I'm not sure that empathy is always the best basis for actual public policy, because when you have group solidarity and empathy based on group solidarity, you're going to attempt to actually benefit the group with whom you have solidarity. So that actually cuts against
But
generalized
that's like a
public
fundamental
policy.
thing that just exists, which is why we need representation in government. Okay, cute. Thank you.
No problem.
Wow, he got it this time. All right, nice. Good to see you. How are you doing?
Doing all right. How are you, Ben?
It's been a day.
Yeah, it's a little bit of like an interesting setting being surrounded by 20 people that disagree with you.
I mean,
Yeah.
the truth is I grew up in LA and then I went to law school in Cambridge. So,
So
I'm
you're
a
a lot
little
more
used to
than
it.
20.
It's not, yeah. I've been here before.
Anyways, let's talk about DEI. Do you think that Trump should have won 2016?
I think Trump. I don't think Trump won 2016.
I'll wrap it in. It's conceptually relevant. I'll demonstrate the relevance.
Okay, sounds good. By what measure? Do I think he did win or do I think he should have won?
Do you think he should have won?
Well, yes, I think he should have won. He was the better candidate than Hillary Clinton.
I mean, yes, I'm happy that he won. If the question is, am I happy that he won? I'm happy that he won.
Okay. Well, I'd say that Trump won 2016 because
By the way, I did not vote for either candidate in 2016. That's a decision made in retrospect.
Awesome. So I think that Trump won 2016 because of a modality of DEI. Essentially, what I'd say is the Electoral College, right, strives for inclusion of smaller states with lower populations by overrepresenting them in the overall vote. Like, you could correct me if I'm wrong, or the SAN fact checkers can. I'm pretty sure that over the last 25 to 30 years, Republicans have won the presidency given the Electoral College, not given the overall popular vote. So if you're against DEI, if you don't want inclusion on the basis of race, inclusion on the basis of gender, or even what you're saying earlier, we could even say inclusion on the basis of class. Why do you want inclusion on the basis of population, rural areas, states,
We should actually use a better example.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. I think this is where I think a lot of people on both sides, liberals and Republicans, conservatives and liberals, fall down this loophole, this rabbit hole of saying that if you are Republican, then you agree with all of these things Republicans have done. Similar to what Republicans say about Democrats. If you agree with this one thing, then you must agree with everything else. And the reality is, again, I don't know the ins and outs of I guess it's called jerry-rigging, or I think it's called jerry-rigging the elections, basically redrawing electoral lines to suit a very specific political party to get them represented in Congress and the Senate, or Congress for sure. Now, of course, I think that is unfair, but I don't know this in detail, so I'm going to assume this is the theory behind why that is the case. So yes, on surface, it is unfair. You're getting smaller groups represented in Congress. But I'm going to take an example from Toronto here, where I live. Downtown Toronto is generally very liberal, NDP, very left-leaning when it comes to elections. I would say more liberal, but there are NDP ridings, right? But within this massive city of 3 or 4 million people, there are conservatives within this group. Now, when you think of the voter turnout as a whole, I think Toronto is overrepresented in comparison to other regions of the country. In fact, I would argue probably the GTA determines elections for our entire country just by the sheer number of voters. So on the basis of that, you have these small pockets of conservatives in downtown Toronto that are underrepresented currently in the general population, in the general result of the elections, right? So if a riding goes liberal and there's hundreds of thousands of people who vote liberal, it's great. But let's say within that riding there's 100 or 200,000 conservatives. It doesn't matter because their voices are completely silenced. Now imagine if most of those conservatives lived in specific areas within that riding. I could see why the government would want to carve that conservative riding out, that conservative area out into its own riding, so that those conservative voters could actually have a voice in Parliament, in the House of Commons. And so that's what I'm thinking is the case, that smaller groups of Republicans in this case would be overwhelmed by the Electoral College. They would not be represented at all, despite so many within those smaller groups being Republican. And perhaps that's the reason, rationale why Republicans redraw those electoral boundaries. That if we were to keep the boundaries the way they are, those large groups of Republican supporters would never have their voices in Congress and in the Senate. Now, I totally agree with you. I think that's wrong on the surface. I think that's not the way to do it. A better approach, to be honest, might be some level of proportional representation. That could actually help with the distribution of votes and the votes for specific groups, and proportionally say this group needs X percent of Congress, as an example. It gets kind of convoluted, but first past the post is, in fact, in many ways, discriminatory and limiting in how we approach elections. And I agree. I think that it is wrong for politicians to redraw those lines. The better approach, I think, may very well be proportional representation, where we say, okay, in this riding, there were 600,000 people who voted, 300,000 voted liberal, 250,000 voted conservative, and 50,000 voted some left wing or communist or whatever party. Okay, so then of that entire amount, we then give that riding, let's say, 3 seats. One is liberal. In that riding, we say of that, 600,000, we say, okay, well, we'll get 6 seats. 3 will be liberal, 2 will be conservative, and whatever, like 0.5, I guess. Well, anyways, it gets weird, it gets odd, but basically that would help with proportional representation of these people who are not kind of voted in, despite so much support in their communities.
Example, I just ask if I believe in the U.S. Senate. Right?
The U.S. Senate, this would also apply to the U.S. Senate.
Right. Okay. So let's use the U.S. Senate, because the U.S. Senate is actually even more unrepresentative of the general population than the Electoral College, which is at least a rough approximation.
It'd just be funnier to hear you say that you shouldn't have voted for Trump in 2016, but we could talk about.
That's a different subject, but yeah. I'm very happy that he won, even though I didn't vote for him. I mean, we can talk about Trump later. Yeah. We've already done a bit. Well, I'm sure we'll do more. As far as the idea that every elected body has to be elected based on population, as opposed to based on the area of geographic distribution or the states that actually pre-existed the federal government. Okay, the way that the Constitution of the United States was created was as a contract between sovereign states, which is one of the reasons why, for example, you have.
Okay, this is getting quite long, and I don't want to bore everyone to death with my answers, but basically what I hope you saw from my answers so far has been, I think a more moderate approach is needed in our politics, because I think, to be honest, people are too quick to get on their high horse and really criticize the left or criticize the right, when in fact there's a lot of agreement on both sides. And if you notice in my answers, I tend to agree with people on disparities, on outcomes, and I push people instead on what their solutions are. Because I think in many cases, many don't know what the solutions are when presented with evidence to show that those solutions aren't actually solutions, that they cause and may create more inequity, more problems, more issues. And I think that's the real issue that many researchers for decades have been raising, which is as we pursue innovative policy, our chances for greater mistakes become heightened. Right? So it's very similar to the stock market, right? Like you invest in a solid blue chip stock, like it's not going to get you the best returns tomorrow, but it's safe. Whereas if you invest in a speculative stock, it's a risk. And there's large rewards and there's large failures that could happen as a result of that, that are multiplied over time. And so I would again argue that what we need is a pragmatic approach to these policies. DEI experts need to understand there are limits to embracing DEI fully, and there are real challenges with representation and who determines that. But the final point I would also say is, I think the fixation on identity is in fact the undoing of liberals' policy ideas. I've said this before on live streams, but if liberals think that full embrace of DEI will win over more voters, it'll only win over a smaller and smaller percentage of voters. The average voter right now is more concerned with their day-to-day living than about representation in Congress, in Senate, on boards, and in their businesses. And that's just the reality of it. But the liberals seem too fixated on representation from underrepresented groups, not recognizing the costs with that, and that that's actually not what the majority is looking for. And that even with those policy ideas, they're innovative on paper, but they come with a host of risks as well. So I hope this mini experiment worked. I don't know if it fully did, but I thought to myself as I watched Ben answer these questions, he was quite forceful in his answers, and there's an approach that could be taken which is more moderate that could actually perhaps help along the conversation so that people get a more moderate view of Republicans, conservatives, liberals, Democrats, and recognize that it's the moderate voice that keeps getting taken out of these discussions. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to keep working on this format to get it better. But that's what I thought when I watched Ben Shapiro on the Jubilee YouTube. And I'm going to keep kind of doing these and getting better at them as well. So thanks again for tuning in, and I will catch you in the next one.